Close your eyes for a second and picture London at the start of the 1700s. A city that feels like it's been rebuilt with one hand, while the other hand is still shoveling yesterday's ash out of the street. By around 1700, the capital is already a giant by English standards, on the order of about 575,000 people, swelling fast, noisy and crowded, with newcomers pouring in because this is where money, work and reinvention live. If you're here with me for the long haul, hit subscribe right now, because we're going to walk this century street by street, and I don't want you missing the best parts. And do me a favour, comment where you're listening from, city, town or country. I read those, and it helps me picture how far these stories are travelling. What hits you first in 1700s London is the contrast. You'll see fresh brick and new stone next to alleyways that still move like the medieval city did. Tight, twisting, loud. After the Great Fire, lawmakers pushed rules, meant to make another inferno less likely, including requirements that the outer parts of buildings be made of brick or stone, a blunt, practical reaction to the nightmare of 1666. That doesn't mean every building suddenly becomes modern, though. The street plan stubbornly keeps its old bones, because property lines and habits don't melt as easily as timber does. So you get this odd feeling, a city wearing newer clothes, but walking in the same old gait. And above those roofs, one silhouette keeps pulling your eye, the rising dome of St. Paul's. Services are being held there before it's fully done, and by 1711 it's officially declared complete. In the early 1700s, it's more than a church. It's a statement to every visitor. London burned, London bled, London rebuilt, and London intends to lead. Now let's drop down from the skyline to street level, because that's where the real London is. Morning arrives early here, not with birdsong, but with wheels, hooves, shouting, and the slap of hurried footsteps. The city runs on human muscle. Porters lugging crates, chairmen carrying sedan chairs, apprentices sprinting errands like their lives depend on it. Every sense is occupied. You smell bread and coal smoke then. 2 steps later, something far less romantic. The reality of a city without modern sanitation. There's no neat separation between clean and filthy the way we're used to now. Waste is a constant companion, and the street itself is part highway, part marketplace, part dumping ground. You learn quickly to watch your footing, and you learn even faster to keep moving because London doesn't pause for anyone. It's a place where a person can be anonymous in a crowd and still feel like the crowd is pressing on their ribs. I always tell viewers, if you want to understand 1700s London, don't start with palaces. Start with what's under your shoes. If you drift east toward the wharves and the working edge of the city, the river starts to feel like a living machine. The Thames isn't just scenery. It's the city's bloodstream, hauling goods and people, dragging London outward into the world. Even when you're not looking at it, you can sense it through the commerce it feeds. Barrels, bales, ropes, timber, sugar, tea, tobacco, cargo that is reshaping diets, fortunes and whole neighbourhoods. And yet, the same river carries the city's grime too. That's the contradiction that keeps showing up. London's wealth and London's waste travelling side by side. If you're trying to cross from one bank to the other in the early part of the century, you're still living in a world where London Bridge dominates the crossing. When Westminster Bridge finally opens on 18th November 1750, it's a genuine turning point, an admission that one bridge can't carry the weight of a metropolis anymore. But before that moment arrives, the river is a stage for thousands of small decisions, whether to pay for a boat, whether to risk the crush on the bridge, whether to transport goods by water because the streets are too clogged. And London Bridge itself, this is where I want you to slow down and really imagine it, because it isn't just a bridge in the way we think of bridges today. For centuries, it's been a built-up place, crowded and intensely used. And even in the 1700s, the push to make it more practical changes its character. Mid-18th century work begins to remove the shops and houses to widen the way, and in 1757-1761, the long inhabited bridge is stripped back, controversially, so traffic can move. It's modernization, but it also feels like erasing a little floating neighborhood. And when winter bites hard, the old stone bridge plays another role. Its design can slow the river enough that ice and debris collect, helping the Thames freeze more readily during severe cold spells. That's part of why frost fairs could happen. Whole little bursts of festivity on the ice. Something that feels impossible until you remember how different the climate could be, and how the river's flow was physically disrupted. Londoners are capable of turning almost anything into an event, even the river freezing. If you want to see the mind of the city, where gossip becomes power and information turns into money, then we need to step inside a coffee house. This is one of those London inventions that doesn't look like a revolution until you watch what it does to people. By 1700, there are over 2,000 coffee houses in London, and they're not just places to drink. They're like open-plan offices, newsrooms, debating clubs, and trading floors rolled into one. The rhythm is simple. You pay, you sit, you listen, you talk, and the city's ideas circulate. What I love about these places is how specialized they become. Certain houses draw certain crowds. Scientists in one corner of town, political factions in another, and the commercial crowd, clustering where shipping news and prices matter most. It's the soundscape that gets me, the scratch of pen on paper, the rustle of newspapers passed from hand to hand, and the low roar of argument that never quite resolves, because tomorrow's paper will bring fresh fuel. Now zoom in tighter, because some of the most modern institutions on Earth are being assembled in these rooms while people sip hot drinks and complain about the weather. Edward Lloyd's Coffee House becomes a recognized center of marine intelligence, and the kind of meeting place where the modern insurance world takes shape, born from practical needs. Ships sink, cargo goes missing, storms don't care about your balance sheet. Meanwhile, at Jonathan's Coffee House, names and numbers begin to behave like a market. In 1698, John Casting starts issuing lists of stock and commodity prices, and that habit of publicly posting prices is part of the long road toward a regulated exchange. This is London's secret. Superpower in the 1700s. It turns conversation into infrastructure. People meet, repeat, standardize, write it down, and suddenly a casual practice becomes an institution. You can almost feel the future leaning into the room. And at the center of it all, the government's finances are changing too, because in 1694, the Bank of England is founded to act as banker to the government and to raise funds, helping build a new kind of national financial machine. All of that high-level money talk might sound distant, but here's the thing. It filters down into ordinary lives in ways people can't always see. A dock worker might not care how government debt is managed, but he definitely cares whether wages are steady, whether bread prices spike, whether there's work tomorrow. The 1700s city runs on labour, and it's not gentle about it. Apprentices are locked into years of service. Servants work long days in households that can treat them as invisible. Street sellers hustle because the next meal depends on the next sale. London is opportunity, yes, but it's also a machine that can chew you up if you miss a step. And yet people keep arriving, because compared to the countryside, the city offers cash, variety, and the strange freedom of being unknown. This is a place where you can become someone else if you can survive long enough to do it. When I read the era's accounts, I'm always struck by how modern that emotional logic feels. The dream of the city, mixed with the fear of it. Fear is part of the landscape too, especially after dark. Early 1700s, London doesn't have the kind of unified professional police force we picture today. Local watchmen and constables exist, but corruption and inconsistency are constant complaints, and much depends on private effort, money, and luck. Reform begins to take more recognisable shape mid-century. On Bow Street, Henry Fielding employs officers who become known as the Bow Street Runners in 1749, a notable step toward organised policing. That doesn't magically make the city safe overnight, but it signals a shift. London is getting too big, too crowded, and too complex to be governed by old systems alone. Crime stories spread quickly here, some exaggerated, some chillingly true, and the public appetite for punishment becomes its own form of entertainment. You can't understand the century without admitting how normal public violence could feel to a crowd that treated it like a day out. And that leads us to the grim theatre of justice that sits right on the edge of everyday life. Executions are public, and people gather, sometimes in enormous numbers, because spectacle is a currency in this city. Tyburn, near what's now Marble Arch, is one of the most notorious sites, and it stays active deep into the century. The last hanging at Tyburn is in 1783, after which executions moved to outside Newgate Prison. If you stand in that moment, late 1700s, you can feel London's identity shifting again. The city is still punishing, still harsh, but the stage is relocating, concentrating the spectacle at the prison itself. Newgate is infamous in its own right, and descriptions of it emphasize cruelty, overcrowding, and the terror of being held there before your fate is decided. When people talk about old London as if it's quaint, I always want to gently push back. A lot of it is fascinating, yes, but it can also be brutal, and the brutality isn't hidden away. It's right out in the open. So what was London like in the 1700s? It's a city of noise and motion, built of brick and ambition, where institutions we still live with, insurance markets, organised finance, early policing, are taking recognisable form, often in surprisingly informal places like coffee houses. It's also a city where daily life is physical. The streets are crowded, the work is hard, the air is thick with smoke, and the gap between comfort and desperation can be one bad week wide. And I want you, as you listen, to keep holding both truths at once. London is becoming a global hub, and it's also still struggling with the basics of living: cleanliness, safety, and stability. That tension is the engine of the century. In the next stretch, we're going to follow that engine as it heats up. The lure and danger of cheap spirits, the packed-in neighbourhoods where the poor try to survive, the booming print culture that spreads scandal and satire, and the way the city's modern face is built right on top of older systems that refuse to die. So let's follow that engine as it really starts to roar, because by the 1730s and 1740s, London's growth isn't just about new buildings and bigger crowds. It's about the pressure building inside ordinary lives. When wages don't stretch, when rent is due, when winter bites, the city produces quick fixes, and some of those fixes come in a small glass. Gin becomes the most controversial comfort of the age. Cheap, strong, and everywhere, blamed for crime, sickness, neglect, and a kind of numbness that looks like survival until it looks like ruin. Parliament tries to slam on the brakes with a heavy hand in 1736. The law, sponsored by Sir Joseph Jekyll, imposes a duty of 20 shillings per gallon on retail gin and demands a staggering $50 annual licence for retailers, plus fines that make prosecution of small sellers easier. In theory, it's moral reform. In practice, it's a collision between lawmakers and street-level reality, because when you make something unaffordable, without removing the reasons people want it, the city doesn't politely comply. It improvises. Here's how improvisation looks in a place like London. It's hidden bottles, backroom pours, substitutes that burn like regret, and a marketplace that slides into the cracks between rules. The 1736 law is widely resisted and hard to enforce, and London becomes a battleground of informers, raids, and public anger. London Lives, built from court records and the daily grind of the justice system, describes how the Act doesn't just tax gin. It creates a framework that helps authorities prosecute unlicensed sellers, including chandlers and alehouse keepers. And that matters because it turns a social habit into a legal dragnet. But the deeper story is the one that never fits neatly into a statute. London is too big, too hungry, and too unequal for one sweeping law to behave like a magic spell. So the city bends, the government adjusts, and by 1751, the reforming energy is back again. This time in a coordinated campaign of pamphlets and petitions, with gin repeatedly tied to a perceived crime wave. Now I need to be careful here, because gin made London do it is the kind of tidy explanation that feels satisfying and still manages to be wrong. Gin isn't a spell. It's a symptom and an accelerant. It doesn't invent poverty, but it can sharpen its edges. And if you want to see the era's fears in a single frozen image, you look at William Hogarth. In 1751, he releases Beer Street and Gin Lane, prints designed to be seen side by side, pushing a moral argument in pictures, health and industry on one street, collapse and despair on the other. What makes Hogarth so powerful isn't just the shock, it's the detail. He points the viewer's eye toward the pawnbroker, the undertaker, the sellers who profit when everyone else is falling apart. It's propaganda, yes, but it's also reportage in the language of satire, a way of saying, if you think this is only about drink, you're not looking hard enough. And then there are the cases that reformers and pamphleteers held up like evidence you could carry in your hands. Stories so brutal they feel almost unreal until you see them in the records. One of the most infamous is the case of Judith Defoe, tried at the Old Bailey in February 1734 for the murder of a child named Mary Defoe. The proceedings are stark. The indictment, the accusation of choking and strangling, and the verdict, guilty, with the sentence of death. Later writers link her story to the era's gin panic, and Hogarth's audiences would have recognized the idea instantly. A city so strained that even motherhood could be depicted as collapsing under pressure. When I read cases like this, I try not to turn them into a cheap shiver for the viewer. Instead, I want you to feel what London felt like. A place where desperation wasn't abstract. Desperation had an address, a courtroom, and sometimes a rope. If we walk toward the neighbourhoods that carried the worst reputations, places that polite Londoners talked about the way you'd talk about a contagion, you enter the world of the rookeries. Rookery isn't a compliment. It's a label for dense, decayed housing packed with the poor. A maze of lodging rooms, courts and alleys that outsiders described as lawless precisely because they didn't understand its informal rules. St Giles becomes the slum that keeps showing up in art and commentary, and modern archaeology and historical work backs up the scale of its notoriety. Excavations and exhibitions on the site describe St Giles as a notorious 18th and 19th century slum, well known in contemporary art and literature, linked with gin houses and hardship. When you imagine it, don't picture one clean, bad street. Picture a cramped, shifting puzzle. Homes subdivided again and again. Landlords with little incentive to repair. Tenants jammed into rooms for a nightly fee. And children growing up fluent in the street long before they can read. And that's the point where London stops being a postcard and becomes a moral test. Because if you live in comfort, the city can feel like a banquet. Theatres, pleasure gardens, elegant shops, a constant sparkle of novelty. If you live in the rookeries, the same city feels like a trap where every door has a price. Overcrowding isn't just unpleasant, it's dangerous. Illness spreads faster, privacy disappears, conflict becomes normal. And yet people remain, because leaving costs money, because work is nearby, because community exists even in the worst places, and because the city's gravity is hard to escape. This is where I always pause, even as I'm narrating, and I try to imagine the sounds at night. Arguments muffled by thin walls, footsteps in a passage, a baby crying, someone laughing too loudly because that's how you keep fear away for one more hour. Now, if London is this harsh, you might wonder, what does compassion look like in the 1700s? It exists, but it often arrives through institutions that feel unfamiliar to modern eyes. Charities, subscriptions, committees, petitions, and a public language of benevolence that sometimes truly helps and sometimes flatters the giver more than it saves the receiver. One of the most important is the Foundling Hospital. Thomas Coram campaigns for years, and a royal charter is issued on 17th of October 1739 to establish what is formally called the Hospital for the Maintenance and Education of Exposed and Deserted Young Children. This isn't a small gesture. This is London acknowledging, in official form, that abandoned infants are not just a scandal but a crisis. You can hear the era's anxieties in the very idea, shame, poverty and survival colliding in the most vulnerable bodies in the city. And the first intake is not some tidy daylight ceremony. It happens in the evening, 8 p.m. on the 25th of March 1741, at a temporary home in Covent Garden, an arrangement that likely helps preserve anonymity for the people bringing children. Mothers and intermediaries leave tokens, often scraps of fabric or small objects, so that identity can be privately preserved even as the child is surrendered. This detail always hits me because it's the human part that survives the paperwork. A mother doesn't just abandon. She marks, remembers, hopes. The hospital becomes famous not only for care and controversy, but for the way it gathers these tiny remnants of ordinary lives, silent proof that behind the statistics were real hands making impossible choices. But London never solves a problem in a straight line. Demand quickly outstrips capacity, and debates over who deserves help, who is worthy, who is idle, who is fallen, who is simply unlucky, keep reshaping policy. The Foundling Hospital expands and changes over time, and later parliamentary decisions briefly push it toward taking far more children than its original model could safely sustain, with outcomes that include shockingly high mortality. The city's generosity is real, but it's also constrained by logistics, money, and the limits of 18th century medicine. And that's a pattern you'll keep seeing. London is learning to build systems, financial systems, policing systems, charity systems. But in the 1700s, those systems are still raw, sometimes effective, sometimes disastrous, always revealing what the city values. At the same time, there's another force knitting London together: print. London's streets don't just carry people and goods, they carry information, news, scandal, sermons, political arguments, satirical poems, advertisements for cures, and warnings about criminals. One academic study of the period notes that in the early 1700s, London could boast at least 18 newspapers, producing around 55 issues per week, with a combined weekly circulation around 44,000. And that's before you account for the way a single paper might be read aloud or pass through many hands. You can feel what that means in practice. A city where rumour gets printed, printed rumour becomes truth, and truth can change the fate of a person or a policy. This is the age when London starts to develop a media metabolism, fast, hungry, and occasionally irresponsible. And where does a lot of that reading happen? back where we started, in public rooms where people gather. Coffee houses become repositories of news, places where papers circulate, where older issues might be kept for reference, and where maritime and commercial communities use printed information as fuel for decisions. That matters because it means London's public opinion isn't just a mood, it's a daily activity. You walk into a room, you hear yesterday's parliamentary debate, you see a notice about a missing person, you learn the latest shipping news, and by the time you step back outside, you're carrying the city's nervous system in your head. This is why reform campaigns can surge so quickly in 1751. Pamphlets and petitions don't drift slowly through society. They move at the speed of coffeehouse conversation. So when you ask, what was London like in the 1700s? It isn't one thing. It's a city where a satire print can function like a public health poster, where an Act of Parliament can collide with a back alley, where a charity can be both merciful and overwhelmed, and where news can spread so widely that it changes behaviour before law ever does. It's also a city that forces you, listening right now, to confront an uncomfortable truth. Modern life didn't begin as clean progress. It began as messy negotiation between need and control, hunger and regulation, compassion and suspicion. And if you stick with me into the next part, we're going to step deeper into the lived experience. How people ate, worked, loved, fought, worshipped, and entertained themselves in a metropolis that could be dazzling at noon and terrifying after dusk, sometimes on the same street. Let's start in the belly of the city, because if you want to understand 1700s London, you follow the food. A London morning is built on markets, baskets, knives and noise, produce brought in from surrounding villages, fish hauled up from the riverside, and bread that people rely on so heavily it becomes a kind of emotional weather vane for the whole metropolis. Covent Garden is already a true provisioning hub by 1700. The Duke of Bedford's market licence dates back to the 1670s, and by the turn of the century there's a regular thrice-weekly market selling fruit, vegetables, flowers, roots and herbs from permanent shops. Walk through and you're hit by layers of scent, green leaves, bruised apples, damp earth, crushed herbs, then the sharper smells of meat and fish the closer you drift toward the river trade. And here's the thing I always try to stress. This isn't quaint. It's logistics. This is a city feeding hundreds of thousands of people every single day without refrigeration, without trucks, without modern sanitation. And yet it mostly works because an army of sellers, carriers and buyers are moving in tight choreography. If you peel away from the formal market stalls and head toward the street cries, London becomes a roaming buffet. Hot pies, roasted chestnuts, oysters, eels, milk, sold by people who know that the difference between a good day and a bad day might be whether a crowd is in the mood to spend a penny. There's a hard practicality to what becomes popular. Portable, filling, cheap and immediate. Fish is a constant presence, and Billingsgate, down by the Thames, has been a trading hub for centuries. London's fish identity isn't a fashion. It's a deep habit tied to the river and the city's appetite. That appetite also shapes the city's soundscape. Bargaining, arguing, joking, warning, hawking. I want you to picture a buyer squeezing a piece of fruit, a seller watching like a hawk, and a porter trying to muscle. A heavy load through bodies that won't move, because nobody here wants to give up their place in line. The city feeds itself in public. And that means eating and commerce are never far apart. Now, if you want to watch London switch masks, from survival to spectacle, you go where people spend their spare coin, because entertainment in the 1700s is a map of the city's desires. Some of it is refined and expensive, and some of it is rowdy enough to make respectable people clutch their pearls. But it's all part of the same ecosystem. A metropolis trying to blow off steam. The pleasure gardens are one of the most revealing inventions here because they turn leisure into a product you can buy by the ticket. Vauxhall begins earlier under the name New Spring Gardens, but what matters for our century is the relaunch. It's reinvigorated by entrepreneur Jonathan Tyers in 1729, and it becomes a flagship of paid public entertainment. People cross the river by boat to get there, and that little journey matters. It makes the night feel like an outing, like you're leaving the everyday city behind, even though you're still in its orbit. Step into a big night at Vauxhall, and it's a sensory overload. Music drifting through trees, lanterns and illuminated walks, supper boxes where couples flirt and friends gossip, and a crowd that blends classes more than polite society likes to admit. It's not a democracy. Money still draws lines, but it's a mixing bowl compared to the rigid world of private balls. And because London never stops competing with itself, Vauxhall gains a fashionable rival. Ranelagh Gardens opens in Chelsea in 1742, with the famous rotunda as its centrepiece, a grand circular interior where the well-dressed come to promenade, listen and be seen. Contemporary visitors talk about it like a social obstacle course. One wrong step, one wrong acquaintance, and you feel the judgment in the air. But for many, that's the thrill. London as a theatre, where you're both audience and actor, turning your own reputation into a performance. Speaking of theatres, let's talk about the stage, because London's playhouses aren't just entertainment, they're social laboratories. The Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, sits right in the beating cultural heart of the city, and in the middle decades it's shaped by one of the era's most influential showmen, David Garrick, who takes over management with James Lacey in 1747 and runs the theatre until his retirement in 1776. Garrick matters not simply because he's famous, but because he understands something London is learning everywhere else too. If you can read the crowd, you can steer the culture. The licensing of plays also tightens the relationship between art and authority. After the Licensing Act of 1737, theatre becomes more regulated, and that pressure changes what can be said on stage and how it's said. So a night at the theatre isn't only about Shakespeare or comedy. It's about what London is allowed to laugh at, what it's allowed to criticise, and how writers slip meaning through the cracks. And when the lights go down, both literally and socially, London shows you a different face. Night in early 1700s, London can be frightening, partly because darkness belongs to whoever is bold enough to claim it. But the city starts fighting back with infrastructure, and it's one of those changes that quietly rewires daily life. Street lighting. According to the Sir John Soanes Museum, a key shift begins in 1736, when an Act of Parliament sets rates for householders and institutions in the City of London to fund streetlights. And by 1739, there are over 4,000 oil lamps in the city, making it exceptionally well lit for its time. Think about what that means in lived terms. A better lit street doesn't end crime, but it changes the odds. It changes the way a woman feels walking home, the way a watchman can see, the way a thief chooses where to lurk. It also changes business. Shops can stay active later, taverns can pull crowds deeper into the evening, and London's tempo stretches out like a day that refuses to end. Still, light doesn't erase danger, it just outlines it. The city's nightlife is a mixture of temptation and routine. Taverns full of talk, coffee houses still humming with argument, and alleys where you hear footsteps and can't tell if they're following you. I want you to imagine the ordinary decisions people make every night. Whether to pay for a coach, whether to join a group for safety, whether to take the long, well-lit way or the short, dark one. Better lighting helps, but London's size creates blind spots no oil lamp can cover. And it's not just muggers people fear. Fire remains an ever-present anxiety in a densely packed city, and disease is a quieter terror, one that doesn't announce itself with a shout. Which brings us to the part of London that is always there, whether people want to look at it or not: illness. Smallpox, in particular, haunts the century like a shadow that can suddenly turn solid. In the early 1700s, the idea of deliberately inoculating someone sounds shocking, almost like inviting the enemy into your house. But some Londoners become convinced it's better than leaving the door wide open. A major milestone is tied to one stubborn, brilliant social figure. After exposure to variolation practices in the Ottoman Empire, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu returns, and in April 1721 has Charles Maitland inoculate her young daughter in London in the presence of physicians, an event often cited as a key early professional inoculation in England. That doesn't mean everyone suddenly applauds. There's fear, religious debate, medical skepticism, and the very real fact that variolation carries risks. But the mere existence of the practice tells you something crucial about 1700s London. This city can be superstitious and cutting-edge in the same breath. It can stage a public hanging and also argue fiercely about a new medical intervention. Contradictions aren't glitches here. They're the operating system. As London's population keeps climbing, another development takes shape that I find deeply revealing: the rise of voluntary hospitals, institutions funded by subscriptions and philanthropy, designed to provide free care to those who can't afford private treatment. Westminster Hospital is founded in 1719, Guy's Hospital in 1721, St George's opens at Hyde Park Corner in 1733, and the London Infirmary, which becomes the London Hospital, begins in 1740, aimed at relieving sick people, including manufacturers and seamen and their families. Middlesex follows in 1745, another piece in this patchwork system of charity and medicine. What strikes me is how these hospitals reflect London's self-image. The city is harsh, yes, but it also wants to see itself as capable of organised compassion, especially when the poor are too many, too visible, and too essential to ignore. Care becomes a civic project, not just a private one. But don't picture these hospitals as clean, quiet places with crisp sheets and modern hygiene. Early 18th century medicine is still wrestling with limited knowledge and limited tools. Surgery is fast because pain relief is minimal. Infection is a constant risk. And success often depends on the patient's strength as much as the physician's skill. Yet even with those limitations, the very act of building these institutions changes the city. It creates new networks of training and reputation, new opportunities for medical students to observe and learn, and new public debates about who deserves treatment. In a way, this is London trying to invent a social safety net out of donations, governance committees, and moral persuasion. It isn't universal, it isn't fair, but it is a system being built in real time, under pressure, with human consequences. Now, zoom back out and you'll see how all of this, food, pleasure, lighting, medicine, sits on top of the everyday mechanics of movement. London is a city of distances that feel shorter on a map than they do under your feet. People walk constantly, and those who can afford it ride, in coaches, in hired vehicles, in sedan chairs carried by sweating men who know the streets like a second skin. The river remains a major artery too. Boats, not only for work, but for leisure, carrying people to places like Vauxhall as much as to wharves and warehouses. And this is where I want you to feel the city's physicality. The press of bodies on bridges, the shove of traffic, the sound of wheels on uneven surfaces, the sudden blockage caused by a cart unloading in the wrong place. London's modern growth doesn't arrive as smooth progress. It arrives as congestion. The metropolis is learning how to move its own weight. And through all of it, class is never absent. The same streets can hold wildly different lives within a few minutes' walk. One person is choosing between the theatre and Ranelagh. Another is choosing between dinner and rent. One household is lit by multiple lamps. Another is rationing candles. One family sees a hospital as a place to donate. Another sees it as the last chance to keep a loved one alive. This is why I keep coming back to the idea that 1700s London is a city of layers. You can't understand it by describing only the rich or only the poor. The century is a constant negotiation between those layers, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent, often tense enough that you can feel it in the way people look at each other. And when the city's pressures spike, prices, politics, war, religion, those layers don't stay neatly stacked. They slip. So here's the thread I want to pull next, because it's where all these daily details start colliding with bigger forces. London doesn't just entertain itself and treat it sick. It argues, it protests, it panics, it riots, it reforms, and it becomes more politically combustible as the century goes on. The streets that carry apples and lanterns can also carry crowds and fury. The newspapers that spread theatre gossip can also spread political fire. The same city that funds hospitals can also tear itself open in moments of collective rage. If you're ready, the next part is where we follow that volatility, how Londoners react when the social temperature rises, and how the capital becomes a stage not only for actors and pleasure seekers, but for mass politics. By the time you reach the middle of the 1700s, London isn't just a city that has crowds. It's a city that thinks in crowds. News moves too fast for authority to always keep up, and the streets themselves become a kind of loud, living bulletin board. You can feel it in the way people cluster around a fresh pamphlet, or how a sharp phrase, one good line, can ricochet through coffee houses, taverns, workshops and markets like it's been fired from a cannon. London's appetite for argument is enormous, and print feeds it daily. When the state tries to clamp down, it often ends up advertising the very thing it wants to silence. In the 1760s, that tension concentrates around a radical journalist and MP, John Wilkes. His paper, The North Briton, becomes a symbol not only of political dissent, but of something Londoners are increasingly unwilling to surrender: public scrutiny. And when the authorities send King's messengers after printers connected to issue number 45, it's not just an arrest story. It's a signal to thousands of Londoners that the government is willing to push into private life to control words on paper. In this city, that kind of signal doesn't fade quietly. It catches. What follows is the sort of chain reaction London does better than anywhere else in Britain. Outrage becomes a rallying cry. The rallying cry becomes a gathering, and the gathering becomes a test of force. In 1768, Wilkes's imprisonment turns into mass protest, and the scene at St. George's Fields in Southwark shows you exactly how combustible the capital can be. A crowd gathers outside the King's Bench prison, and soldiers eventually fire. An innocent bystander named William Allen is killed, and the event becomes known as the Massacre of St. George's Fields. That single detail, an innocent bystander, matters because it hardens a public mood. The political fight is no longer only about Wilkes. It becomes about whether ordinary Londoners can be punished for being present. Parliament is drawn in too. Allen's father petitions for justice, and suddenly a street tragedy becomes a formal grievance. Anger translated into paperwork, and paperwork translated back into wider outrage. When you imagine Londoners talking about it afterward, don't picture calm debate. Picture raised voices, beer cups thudding on tables, someone repeating the story with new details each time, until the city's version of events feels like a shared possession. And here's where London gets especially interesting. It isn't only the mob versus government. The City of London has its own power, its own officials, and its own sense of identity, and sometimes that civic machinery sides with popular sentiment. In 1771, the long-running battle over reporting parliamentary debates hits a breaking point. Parliament had tried to treat publication of debates as a breach of privilege, but printers keep pushing, because the public wants to read what MPs are saying. The legal struggle that finally ends, Parliament's serious attempts to prevent these unofficial reports, is closely associated with Wilkes and the city's officials. In effect, the effort to stop printers collapses under political resistance and public pressure. After that, Parliament largely stops trying to enforce its older bans, and London's political bloodstream changes, because when people can regularly read debates, they can argue about politics with sharper information, not just rumour. It's one of those turning points that sounds technical but feels personal. The city is learning to watch its rulers in near real time. Now hold that thought, because once Londoners get used to watching power, they also get used to demanding things from it. And this is where the city's energy becomes unpredictable. London gatherings can be festive, curious, even joyful. Think of pleasure gardens and bustling markets. But the same human machinery can flip if fear or resentment takes the wheel. Better street lighting makes some streets safer, but it doesn't remove the deeper causes of volatility. High prices, wartime anxiety, prejudice, the sense that the powerful live in a different universe. When I read letters and accounts from the era, I'm always struck by how modern the emotional landscape is. People don't riot because they love chaos. They riot when they feel unheard, cornered, or convinced that the usual channels, petitions, courts, elections, won't deliver. And in 1700s London, once a crowd is moving, it can feel like weather. You can predict conditions. You can see clouds forming, but once the storm breaks, individuals inside it don't always control what it becomes. By the late 1770s, that storm potential is intensified by religion and war. Parliament passes the Catholic Relief Act in 1778, often called the Papists Act, offering limited relief from older anti-Catholic laws if Catholics take a loyalty oath. It doesn't grant full freedom of worship, but it does allow Catholics, under conditions, to do things like join the army and purchase land, and that modest shift is enough to trigger furious backlash among those who treat no popery as a political identity. The timing is combustible. Britain is deep in the American War of Independence, and then fighting France and Spain too. Pressure and resentment are already high, and some people are eager to blame internal enemies for external threats. It's the kind of climate where a rumour can feel like proof, where a petition can feel like a weapon, and where prejudice can recruit thousands with frightening speed. So, on 2nd June 1780, London witnesses the kind of moment that's hard to imagine until you remember how dense and loud this city already is. A huge crowd, often estimated around 50,000, moves across London to deliver a petition to the House of Commons, led by Lord George Gordon and the Protestant Association. It begins as a protest, but once the crowd reaches Westminster, the situation tips into violence. Think about how that would feel from inside the city. You hear a roar in the distance, you see people running, you watch shutters slam, you smell smoke before you see it. Londoners are used to bustle, but this is different. This is the sound of a crowd no longer behaving like a crowd of shoppers. And because the target is framed as Catholics, the violence rapidly finds victims. Chapels, homes, and symbols of state authority. As the days unfold, the Gordon riots become the most destructive urban unrest London has seen in living memory. Prisons are attacked, and the burning of Newgate becomes one of the most iconic images of the chaos. So iconic that satirical prints and contemporary descriptions fix it in the public imagination. Flames pouring from the prison facade, The crowd pressed forward in a mix of frenzy and grim excitement. This isn't only anti-Catholic violence anymore. It becomes an assault on institutions, on confinement, on authority, on anything that looks like the machinery of rule. And there's a terrifying logic to it. Free the prisoners, break the tolls, strike the symbols, and for a moment the city feels like it has no master. Even the language that survives from this week is chilling. The idea of king mob, the sense that the crowd itself has become a sovereign power. London, the city that sells entertainment nightly, is now watching its own apocalypse as a kind of spectacle. Except this time, the sets are real buildings and the fire is not staged. The Bank of England becomes a focal point of fear because it represents the state's financial heart. Order turned into paper, authority turned into numbers. During the riots, the city's leadership asks for protection, and a military guard is put in place. When the mob attacks, it's driven off with casualties. This is where the riot stops feeling like unrest and starts feeling like civil war in miniature, troops firing on groups that refuse to disperse, and a death toll that's commonly estimated in the hundreds, often cited around 300-700 fatalities across the week. The violence is not a single night. It's sustained. It spreads. It scares the wealthy, yes, but it also scares ordinary families who simply want their street to remain their street. If you lived in London at the time, you didn't need political theory to understand what was happening. You understood it in the simplest way. Your home might burn, your shop might be smashed, your child might not come back if they go out to look. After the fires die down, the city is left with a question that doesn't go away. How do you govern a metropolis that can convulse like this? Contemporary reactions include renewed demands for more effective means of maintaining order, what we'd later recognize as pressure for stronger policing and more coordinated public control. The Gordon riots also expose how tangled London's grievances have become. Religion is the spark, but the fuel includes resentment over war, economic stress, and the feeling that elites are insulated from consequences. This is why I always describe late 18th century London as modern in a way that isn't flattering. It's modern because it's complex. It has layered loyalties, parish, city, crown, party, class, and when those layers clash, the friction can ignite. A petition can become a riot. A newspaper report can become a rally. A crowd can become a government for a night. And that volatility doesn't disappear when the century ends. It carries forward into the reforms and anxieties of the 1800s. But step back for a breath, because London never stops being London even while it's boiling. Markets still open, carriers still haul, people still cross the river, still gossip in coffee houses, still flock to theatres and gardens when they can. The city is constantly trying to return to routine, the way a body tries to return to normal temperature after a fever. And that, to me, is one of the most human truths of the century. Even in an era of riots and radical politics, most Londoners are just trying to stitch together a life. Work, food, shelter, a bit of laughter if they can afford it. The same print culture that inflames protest also sells entertainment and scandal. The same streets that host marches also host street sellers calling out oysters and hot pies. London contains multitudes, and it forces them to share pavement. By the time you reach the century's edge, the scale of the city is about to become undeniable in numbers as well as feeling. The first UK census in 1801 records London's population at just over 1 million, confirming what anyone living there already sensed. This is a metropolis on a new scale, pushing beyond older systems of governance, health, transport, and policing. That milestone matters because it closes the 1700s with a kind of warning label. The 18th century built the foundations: finance, print, public entertainment, early civic reforms. But it didn't solve the problems that mass urban life creates. Those will crash into the 19th century with force: industry, migration, housing pressure, and the giant engineering projects London will eventually need just to remain livable. In a way, the 1700s are the century where London becomes confident it can reinvent itself, and also the century where it discovers reinvention has a cost. And that brings us to the end of our walk through 1700s London. The brick-built confidence after the fire, the roar of coffee-house debate, the pleasures lit by thousands of lamps, the charity and medicine trying to patch the wounded, and the political storms that could set the city alight. If you've been with me through all 4 parts, thank you, seriously. I'm building these episodes like a long conversation across time, and I want this channel to feel like a place you come back to when you want history that's vivid, grounded, and honest about what it cost people to live through it. Tell me in the comments, do you want our next deep dive to stay in London? And if so, which corner? Docks, theatres, crime, medicine, politics? Or should we time travel to another city next? Either way, I'll meet you there, and we'll step into the past together.